Harry, I'm going to start with you. I wonder if there was a time in your life that was pre-feminism. Was there a sort of awakening that you remember when things felt very different?
Oh, absolutely distinctly. I remember growing up, you know, the idea that the big ambition for a girl was to get a good husband. And once she'd achieved that lofty ambition, to be a good housewife to that husband. And men were regarded as superior and women subordinate. And the thing about the women's movement that came along said, no, we're not inferior. We want to be treated as equal. We want to be partners with our husbands,
Do you remember
not obey them.
accepting it at first?
No, I didn't accept it because my mother didn't accept it. And I remember her saying to me, most people think that if a man says something, it's more likely to be true than if a woman says it, but I don't agree with that. So I was getting subversive messages. However, also, you know, getting the general view that I should get a husband and get a bit of education, but not too much, because no man would want to marry a girl who was too clever by half in case she outshone him. So there was a lot of mixed messages going on. And then, bang, the women's movement came along and said, forget about all that. We want to be equal in the home, outside the home, in public life, everything.
Ash Sarkar, do you think there has been a moment for you, or do you think that feminism has cared for the most vulnerable as it's travelled?
I was really lucky in how I was raised. I grew up with feminism. So my mum, from a really early age, would make these picture books with pictures of me and my sister in it doing adventurous things just so we could grow up with that sense of possibility. But as she taught us about some of her experiences in the women's movement in the 70s and 80s, she did also tell us that it wasn't always the most accommodating place to be a woman of colour, and that as much as we talk about a mainstream history of feminism, which is pretty much the one that we're celebrating today, there is also a kind of counter-history of feminism led by female trade unionists, led by migrant women, led by women of colour, who are also crossing over with anti-colonial movements or anti-racist movements. So I think one of the things that's always really important to remember is that there's not a single feminist movement, there's lots of them. And
but they don't contradict each other, or you think they pull in different directions? What do you sense?
I think that quite often they pull in different directions, but they don't have to. And the reason why they pull in different directions is because social movements will also reflect the hierarchies that exist in society. And it's only through solidarity we can try and redress that.
Tracy, I can't think of a contemporary artist who has sort of lifted the lid on women more than your work, whether it's sexual behaviour, whether it's abortion, whether it's just the sort of, you know, the sort of raw truth about what it is to, you know, be a woman and all the difficult bits. Do you think that you started a conversation there that wasn't being had before?
Yeah, I think a lot of the things that have happened to me in my life, whether it's rape, whether it's abortion. I was raised by, my mum was a single mum who raised me. I think having all of those experiences made me a much stronger woman, because it's pretty painful. The whole thing's painful. Being a woman is excruciatingly painful.
And when you talked about rape, when you talked about your own abortion, did you feel that that was breaking a big taboo?
Yeah, I think so. I think a lot of women are really ashamed about abortion, for example, but I've always said no woman wants to have an abortion. It's not like I feel, oh, I woke up today and felt like having an abortion. You do it with like, it feels horrific to go through that. No woman wants to have an abortion. You're in a situation where you feel that it's Hobson's choice. You absolutely have no choice. That's how you feel, and that's what makes you take that action. Maybe in hindsight you regret it or whatever, but at the time that is all you can possibly do, and you feel very much alone. And I think society has been incredibly cruel to a lot of women that have had to make that decision one way or another.
And do you think this is a valuable conversation that has been had now? Do you think this has been a liberation for women to talk and to do?
But we're speaking as if feminism was sort of invented in the late 20th century, whereas I see it as going back thousands of years. I mean, you think of La Sistrata, you know, a terrific campaign getting all the women on board to end war, and men who have campaigned for...
Just on some of Tracy's points there, being able to talk about abortion, being able to have abortion, is that progress for you?
Well, I mean, for sure, the last 100 years have been progress, absolutely. I think we have made mistakes, as you do with any, you know, radical changes. And I think the biggest mistake I would pinpoint is when You know, there were some ways in which 100 years ago women's lives were better than men's. And instead of men's being raised to women's standards, women's... So if you take, for instance, lung cancer, men have very, you know, steadily, fewer and fewer men are dying of lung cancer. More women are dying of lung cancer. You know, so we're doing something wrong there when 100 years ago women smoked much less than men.
You could take the breast cancer and the prostate cancer levels.
Yeah,
and
but no,
reverse
but what
them.
I'm saying, that's not really what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, you know, alcoholism. 100 years ago, men were 3.5 times more likely to be drinking to their own detriment. Now that gap has narrowed, but it's narrowed in the wrong direction. The same with promiscuous sex and all sorts of things. So although we would all agree, of course we would agree, that the last 100 years have been a huge progress. Not everything has been right.
I feel
And a lot of
women.
women were dying before the age of 45
no,
from
look,
childbirth. They
for
didn't
sure.
make past
No.
45.
No,
So forget the lung cancer. They didn't even get through childbirth. They didn't get through.
Yeah,
a
you're
lot
not
of women.
hearing what I'm saying. This is all, you know, by and large, it's progress. Of course it is. We're all very grateful for the last 100 years. I'm just saying not everything have we got right. Of course we haven't, because you don't need any movement.
I mean, I was going to say, I would like to make a lot more progress in promiscuous sex, right? Speak for yourself here. But I think this idea that...
Well, actually, a lot of girls don't...
The point that I'm making here is that one of the things that I think we need to get back to doing is talking about power rather than just personal choices. And I think that a feminism which emphasises, like, oh, how much sex is the feminist amount of sex to have, or how much should you be drinking, or this, that, and the other, misses the point. The point is that women politically, socially, and economically are disempowered. It's really got nothing to do with these personal choices that someone makes.
Of course, we'd all agree on that. I was just pinpointing a tiny little detail about what we're talking about, which is we haven't got everything right, that's all.
OK, on that note, let's move on to one of the big issues of the present. The gender pay gaps have generated hundreds of column inches in recent weeks, and as this graph shows, the gap is still very present. By the time a girl hits 20 years old, there's already a pay gap, but that rapidly expands as women hit childbearing age. So I'm going to start. I know you just want to come in there, Harriet. If you can bring in that thought. How is it that we can be 47 years on from the Equal Pay Act and still be talking about this?
Well, because pay discrimination, in the past, you know, in the sort of pre-feminist days, it was positively regarded as a bad thing to argue for a woman's pay rate to be equal to a man's, because after all, he had to be the breadwinner, he had to bring home the family wage, and it was distracting against the struggle for him to have a proper wage, to argue for her wages. So it was frowned upon, including in the trade union movement. And then the argument was that actually women were entitled to equal pay. And we've changed that mood in that everybody now agrees it's right that women should have equal pay. But of course, pay discrimination flourishes in secret. Now we've got the transparency which is coming in, where everyone's going to have to publish their pay gap if they employ more than 250 people by April. And at that point, we'll be able to see laid bare the extent of the discrimination and be able to tackle it. But part of it is because of the unequal division of labour in the home. If you've got a situation where women have most responsibility for caring for children and older relatives, then the corollary of that is that they lose out in the workplace. And that's why men's involvement in the home with their own children and their own elderly relatives is important, as well as women being able to do more at work.
Have we overly defined the role, then, that men can play without feeling emasculated or damaged in some way? I mean, you know, women can now do everything, can't they? They can do every job and they can stay at home and they can look after children, but it's much harder for a man to take that role in the home without it being...
But there's still legislation that discriminates against men.
Well, there's a thing here is that we fought for maternity pay and leave, and we fought for it to be longer and it to be higher. We also fought for paternity pay and leave. But actually, at some point, we're saying, well, why don't men fight for paternity pay? Instead of saying to us how difficult it is for them to ask to work part-time, why don't they fight for that? Because we can't fight men's battles as well as women's.
I know we're on the equal pay thing, but everyone keeps talking about 100 years. It's not 100 years. For the majority of women, it's 90 years. The vote for the majority of women came in 1928, and you had to be a property owner, you had to be university educated, and you had to be over 30. So we can now start talking about class. That cut out the majority of women in this country. And sadly enough, the majority of women in this country will only vote what their husbands vote, I'm afraid. And a lot of people will shoot me down for that, but it's true.
I'm really glad that you mentioned class, and I think that this is a good time to think about how race, class and gender all work together, because there is a gender pay gap. That gender pay gap gets worse if you're a woman of colour. If you're a black woman, you're 3 times more likely to be unemployed than if you're a white woman. So all these things have economic outcomes, and it also means that you can have patriarchy without the immediate figure of a patriarch. You just have these deeply unequal outcomes that need addressing. And I think one of the things that's negatively affected us, sorry if I just can finish this thought, is the demise of union agitation for better pay and conditions along the lines of gender and race, because in the era of like Sheryl Sandberg, we think that if we just improve our attitude, we'll get treated better at work. No, you can only improve your conditions if you collectively agitate.
So, Ash, can I just ask you, and I'll bring you in, Anne, is the problem then that women have tried to emulate the male working pattern as opposed to finding or discovering their own?
Well, I think it's a mischaracterisation to imply that feminism is about individualism, because for the most part, feminism was a creed of solidarity, and what we wanted is the collectivism in the workplace of trade unionism to adopt the rights of women as well as the rights of men, and therefore some feminists have argued for individualism, but actually the majority would want collective action.
Which is talking about one strain of feminism, and I'm saying that there is a different kind of feminist history, a socialist feminist history, which I think is more useful to improving workplace conditions.
I'm glad you brought up the fact that women of colour are even more discriminated against than other women.
It sucks.
Yeah. And that's, of course, we must address that. But there is a fundamental difference between racial discrimination and gender discrimination, in that one day we can envisage full equality across the races, OK? Now, let me finish. With the sexual differences, in a sense, there will never be that unless we're constantly striving for it, because women will always be more vulnerable. We're weaker physically, generally speaking, and our reproductive functions make us more vulnerable socially.
So you think we will wipe out racism before we wipe out sexism?
We will never wipe out...
Why does it matter that we're weaker physically? What are we...
Because when I walk down the street, I am more vulnerable than when my husband walks down the street. That is absolutely obvious. So the reason I raise that is because there's a sense in which we will always have to keep striving for sexual equality, and we will only get it when we get things like better childcare.
With all due respect, I think this is really ahistorical. So you look at this public and private divide between home and work. This is really a product of the Industrial Revolution.
I know it is.
Similarly, racism is a product of historical forces.
Yes.
And if I can just say, in terms of what I have felt to hold me back in my life, what I have experienced the most violence and hostility for, it has been my race and not my gender.
Of course it has, but the point is that women in, 500 years' time, well, I mean, maybe we'll have babies born in labs, but the point is that women have to take more time out of work to have a baby. Even if they only take a few days out of work, it's still more than men have to. So unless we have proper childcare, unless we have... unless we keep fighting positive discrimination.
Well,
I'm just going to move us on, because Anne's talked about the future, 500 years and babies born in labs, and something quite odd or interesting is going on now. Where is the future of this debate? Where will it go next? Following the Women's March in Washington last year, you might remember a backlash when some of the women talked about female empowerment is being framed. The use of pink pussy hats, they were called, banners associating the movement with vaginas, were criticised by transgender activists. And this year, the Pussycat movement said it would discard the pink hats and the vagina as a symbol of female empowerment to make sure no one felt excluded. So I'm wondering now, what does the future look like? Tracy, I'm going to start with you. Do you think we are re-evaluating gender as a whole?
When I first went to art school in 1983 for my interview, I was interviewed by 2 women, the heads of the department, and they asked me one question. They said to me, what do you think of feminism? This is in 1983, and I said, I don't. And they said, why not? I said, I just have to do what I have to do to get on with everything. And that's always been my attitude. And I think a lot of women spend too much time talking about things, getting theories, sitting down. It's no good just sitting down at a table and being an armchair feminist. You have to actually get out there, change things, have a voice and be motivated. I have changed a lot in the art world. I have changed a lot for women. I have got a very loud voice on women's issues because I live them. I'm not sitting around philosophizing. I have gone through these things. I have been raped. I have had abortions. My list is endless of my catastrophes in my life. I'm not sitting here like looking for a history book and guessing what's going to happen in the future.
Ash,
I'm talking about here and now and how we must change things and what we must do.
I would like to see one big policy change, and I think it would make life better for a lot of women in this country. I would like to see an end to the hostile environment immigration policy. So in March last year, a 5-month pregnant woman who had been kidnapped and raped over a period of 6 months went to the police to report her experience. When she was taken to a rape crisis centre, she was then arrested and interrogated for immigration offences. The immigration policy that we have today makes women vulnerable. We incarcerate victims of torture, sexual violence in Yarlswood, and that's got to end. That is one winnable policy.
It has to come back to, for you, race has to be intrinsic to the feminist debate. Let me just ask you...
Race and class.
Race and class, all right. To Anne and to Harriet then, this move of feminists that I was just talking about in terms of the march, to if you like, to take the vagina out of feminism, to de-gender everything. Do you appreciate that? Do you understand that? Is that where we're going now, to say, I don't want to recognise the female, I don't want to recognise the feminine, I want to try and move somewhere totally neutral?
Well, I'm always a bit anxious about when the sort of general progressive movements seem to be arguing amongst themselves rather than looking to all the wrongs that are out there. And I think rather than a sort of internal critique of feminism, we should be looking at the problems of misogyny and turning ourselves outwards. And people will... Every sort of discrimination and prejudice is wrong, whether it's on race or disability or gender or sexual orientation. And everybody's got to fight in their own way. But all of them, whatever people are doing on those issues, is better than the people who are opposing change and opposing equality. So I think, in a way, we shouldn't have a hierarchy of inequality or judge each other too harshly, because we're always being judged ourselves. We've got to try and be generous to all of us who are fighting against hatred and prejudice and for equality.
Anne, I'll give you the last thought on this.
Thank you. Well, I want to go back to where you started, which is our personal experiences. My inspiration through my life actually has been my mother, who was the most amazing person. She came over to this country as an 18-year-old on her own from Australia to take up a maths scholarship to Cambridge, where women couldn't take degrees, a men's subject. She's taught some of the best mathematicians in the country. She taught Andrew Wiles, who proved Fermat's theorem. And yet, her greatest joy, actually, I'm going to be shot down for this, but her greatest joy was being a wife and a mother. Now, what my mother had, which was so wonderful, was the most terrific joy in life. She had her choices. She could do this. She had a fantastic brain, and yet the most important thing to her, even more important than maths, which she adored, was the people in her life. And she just symbolises to me fantastic
I'm just going to say one thing. She still had a period, and she still had to pay tax on every tampon and every sanitary towel she used, and that should be stopped immediately. That's barbaric that women have to pay tax.
Yes, I agree with you, but she didn't let that hold her down. She never mentioned it because she just enjoyed life.
We've run out of time, but thank you all very much indeed. Thank you for coming in.